This year's climate meeting was widely considered to be the most important since the Paris Agreement in 2015, where countries committed to reduce emissions and try and limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees and strive to 1.5 degrees. Over the last 3 years, countries have been doing the groundwork and a lot of technical negotiations to be able to agree on the rulebook in order to implement the Paris Agreement. What's really important to remember is that this is a unique diplomatic exercise. Imagine having nearly 200 people for dinner and everybody has to agree to eat exactly the same thing. Every country have to try and align their economies in order to agree on the same rules to tackle climate change. Nearly 30,000 people attended this year's climate meeting. So the climate talks actually offer a space for campaigners and lobbyists and business lobbyists to try and push and influence the outcome of negotiations. In October, the IPCC published a really important scientific report, which showed that we have 12 years to take rapid, unprecedented and transformative measures across all of society in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. That means that we need to cut emissions by 45% by 2030. And 4 countries, including the US, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Russia, all of which are huge oil producers, blocked the welcoming of the report's findings. In the end, what we have is a watered-down compromise where countries welcome the timely completion of the report rather than the findings. JSW, the EU's largest coking coal company, was actually the main sponsor of the climate conference. And inside the conference itself, each country has a pavilion where it can sort of show off its climate efforts. And there were plenty of corporations, fossil fuel companies, which were sponsoring those stands as well. So for instance, the EU's own pavilion was sponsored by Gas Naturally, which is a very powerful gas lobby group. Campaigners inside the talk organised a toxic tour pointing out those big corporates and big polluters, which actually have been allowed not only to attend the climate conference, but to have quite a powerful influence on the process by being able, for example, to display their logos and to push for their own interests inside the negotiations. AITA represents big companies like Shell, BP, Eni, ExxonMobil, Chevron, etc. AITA has actually been trying to influence one specific aspect of the Paris Agreement rulebook. It's known as Article 6 in the climate jargon, but it covers voluntary carbon markets. The whole idea is to actually reduce emissions globally and increase ambitions. But a lot of the big corporations and big polluters are actually using the carbon market mechanisms as an excuse to replace climate action. So they're not actually doing anything concrete to reduce their emissions. I've been talking to the CEO of this big trade lobby group, and what he told me is that AITA has been directly involved in making suggestions and proposals to try and influence the outcome of this specific voluntary carbon market text. Shell's own chief climate advisor, David Hone, actually told a side event that Shell was partly responsible through its engagement with AITA for having these voluntary carbon markets included in the Paris Agreement in the first place. It's also worth noting that this is the only part of the Paris rulebook that hasn't been finalized at this COP, but it's also the part of the Paris Agreement which has the potential for the greatest loopholes, so this is definitely something to watch. Earlier this year, the Polish Parliament passed a bill to ban any spontaneous protests during the entire period of the climate talks. On top of that, they allowed police to gather personal data of all participants. Days before COP actually began, the Polish Prime Minister issued a terror alert. That meant that there was huge police presence in and around the conference centre, including riot police throughout the entire fortnight of the talks. There was one protest that was allowed by the authorities, and that took place on the Saturday, 8th of December, and that was the March for Climate. And I believe there were plenty of March for Climates that happened around the world at the same time. More than 1,000 people gathered in Katowice for the occasion, and it was overwhelmingly peaceful, but accompanied by huge police presence with police officers wearing riot shields, rifles, tear gas canisters, and so on. The ban on protest did not affect anything happening inside the conference center.
We hold the solutions and we know that we must keep it in the ground! 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 We are unstoppable and now the world is possible!
On the last day, hundreds of campaigners gathered in the middle of the conference centers and sat on some steps. And their message was, pick your side. Which side are you on? The people's or the polluters? Many people will remember COP24 by the presence of 15-year-old Greta von Berg. She's a Swedish girl who's been striking for climate change since the end of August and made a really impassioned speech in front of Antonio Guterres, the UN chief, warning that adults were behaving like children and it was more than time that real climate action took place inside this process.
I've learned that you are never too small to make a difference. And if a few children can get headlines all over the world just by not going to school, then imagine what we could all do together if we really wanted to.
Now, around the world, there are hundreds and thousands of people rising up in a mass people's movement, demanding that their governments do more for climate action. They are really bringing home this sense of urgency. And from what I've seen, I don't think that that sense of urgency has been fully embraced by COP24 in the UN climate talks process. Whether that process is able to actually embrace that sense of urgency and tackle it and respond to it is yet to be seen, but for the moment it still has a long way to go. It's important to note that Donald Trump has said he wanted the US to quit the Paris Agreement. That has not yet happened and won't happen until 2020. So the US is still very much part of the process. Jair Bolsonaro will take office on the 1st of January. He said that he also wanted to quit the Paris Agreement. That process will take several years before it actually kicks into action. Donald Trump was very much an isolated case so far. Now he might have found a peer on the world stage to push his message of climate denialism forward. So the next COP, which will happen in Chile next year, will be very interesting to watch, specifically on that issue.